The crack of a gunshot echoed through Redemption Springs as Mason Aldridge stood motionless in the dusty street, his weathered hand hovering inches from his holster while the man who'd challenged him crumpled to the ground. The year was 1878, and like most afternoons in this unforgiving Arizona Territory town, the citizens gathered to witness what passed for entertainment men settling scores with lead and powder. You ever seen Aldridge do anything but shoot or brood? A voice called from the boardwalk, loud enough for the tall cowboy to hear as he holstered his Colt. Mason ignored the commentary as he always did. At 32, he'd cultivated a reputation as the most dangerous and least sociable man in 3 counties. His tall frame, perpetually dressed in black, moved with deliberate precision as he stepped over the wounded challenger who was being tended to by the local doctor. "They say he ain't never danced a step in his life," another voice added. "Too stiff to move to music, I reckon." This particular observation had followed Mason for years. The townsfolk said the cowboy would never dance, and he never had. Not at gatherings, not at weddings, not even at his own sister's celebration 5 years back before she moved east with her husband. Dancing required joy, and joy was something Mason Aldridge had buried alongside his parents and younger brother after the Apache raid on their homestead 15 years ago. Mason pushed through the batwing doors of the Silverado Saloon, his spurs announcing his arrival with their familiar jingle. The piano player faltered for just a moment. He always did when Mason entered before continuing his jaunty tune. The usual afternoon crowd parted silently, creating a path to the bar. "Whiskey," he said, placing a coin on the counter. The bartender, Frank, nodded and poured without comment. Mason took his drink to his usual corner table, sitting with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, a habit formed from years of making enemies and surviving their vengeance attempts. He didn't notice the stagecoach arriving outside, nor did he pay attention to the newcomers entering the establishment until a flash of deep blue fabric caught his eye. She stood in the doorway, her travel-worn appearance doing nothing to diminish her striking presence. Chestnut hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, and intelligent eyes surveyed the room with a mixture of wariness and determination. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who knew her worth in a world that often didn't. Frank approached her immediately. "Can I help you, madam?" "I'm looking for Sheriff Wallace," she replied, her voice carrying a slight Eastern refinement. "I was told I might find him here. Left about an hour ago, said he was riding to the Coleman Ranch to settle a dispute, won't be back till morning most likely." Disappointment flashed across her face before resolution took its place. "I see. Then perhaps you could direct me to suitable lodgings. I've just arrived on the afternoon coach. Widow Henson runs a boarding house 2 streets over. Clean place, fair prices," Frank offered. "Thank you." She glanced around the room, her gaze briefly meeting Mason's before moving on. "And might there be employment opportunities in town? I'm looking to settle." This piqued the interest of several patrons, Mason noted. Single women who weren't saloon girls were rare in Redemption Springs. "What kind of work you looking for, miss?" someone called out. "I'm a teacher by training," she answered, "but I'm willing to consider alternatives." Mason returned to his whiskey, trying to ignore the stir the woman was causing. It wasn't his concern. Nothing in this town was his concern beyond his own survival and the small horse ranch he'd built outside town. The next morning found Mason riding into town for supplies. The general store was his first stop, and as he entered, he discovered the newcomer engaged in conversation with Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife. "We've been hoping for a proper teacher for nearly 2 years," Mrs. Peterson was saying enthusiastically. "The children gather in the back room of the church 3 days a week, but Reverend Collins can only teach them so much." "I'd be delighted to meet with the town council," the woman replied. "I have references and credentials from Boston." "Boston," Mrs. Peterson sounded impressed. "Whatever brings you all the way out here, miss?" "Nora Owens," she supplied. "And as for why I'm here, let's just say I was seeking a change." Mason moved toward the counter, his supply list in hand. Both women turned at his approach, Mrs. Peterson offering a polite nod while Miss Owens regarded him with open curiosity. "Mr. Aldridge," Mrs. Peterson said, "have you met our new arrival? Miss Owens hopes to become our schoolteacher." Mason merely nodded in acknowledgement. "Mr. Aldridge," Nora said, extending her hand. "A pleasure." Mason stared at her outstretched hand for a moment too long before taking it briefly. Her skin was softer than he expected, though he could feel calluses that suggested she wasn't entirely unaccustomed to work. "Miss Owens," he responded, his voice rough from disuse. An awkward silence followed before Mason handed his list to Mrs. Peterson and stepped back, waiting for her to gather his items. "Mr. Aldridge is one of our local ranchers," Mrs. Peterson explained as she moved around the store. "Keeps mostly to himself, but raises some of the finest horses in the territory." "Is that so?" Nora said, her gaze returning to Mason with genuine interest. "I've always admired horses, magnificent creatures." Mason shifted uncomfortably under her attention. "They're just animals," he replied gruffly. "No animal is just an animal, Mr. Aldridge. Each has its own spirit, its own way of seeing the world." Her voice carried conviction. "Horses especially, they mirror our souls." The observation struck Mason as unexpectedly perceptive, and he found himself looking at her more carefully. There was something in her eyes, a shadow of experience, that seemed at odds with her proper Eastern appearance. "Your supplies, Mr. Aldridge," Mrs. Peterson interrupted, placing his goods on the counter. Mason paid and gathered his items, nodding once more to both women before heading to the door. "Mr. Aldridge," Nora called after him. "I understand there's to be a town gathering this Saturday evening. Will you be attending?" The question caught him off guard. Nobody had asked about his social plans in years. "No, madam," he answered without turning around. "I don't attend gatherings." "That's a shame," she replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I was hoping to learn more about those horses of yours." Mason continued through the door without responding, but something about the encounter stayed with him as he rode back to his ranch. The new schoolteacher was different from the other women in town. There was a directness to her gaze that most found disconcerting in a woman, but Mason recognized it as the same watchfulness he carried himself, the look of someone who had seen too much of the world's harshness. The week passed quickly, with Mason focusing on breaking a particularly stubborn 3-year-old stallion. The work demanded his complete attention, leaving little time for thoughts of town or its newest resident. Still, on Saturday evening, as dusk painted the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he found himself thinking about the gathering taking place in town. It had been years since he'd attended any social function. After returning from the war and then losing his family, he'd withdrawn from society almost completely. The townsfolk had eventually stopped expecting his presence, ceased inviting him except out of the most perfunctory politeness. Mason sat on his porch, a cup of coffee cooling beside him as he cleaned his revolver, a nightly ritual. The distant sound of music drifted from town, carried on the desert breeze. Without fully acknowledging his decision, he set aside the gun, went inside to wash, and changed into his least worn shirt. 20 minutes later, he rode into town, telling himself he was only going to check on a horse he'd sold to the blacksmith last month. The smithy's shop was dark and locked, of course, because everyone in Redemption Springs was at the social gathering in the newly constructed town hall. Mason tied his horse and stood outside, listening to the music and laughter spilling from the building. Through the windows, he could see couples dancing, children playing, tables laden with food. He remained in the shadows, an observer of a life he no longer participated in. "Mr. Aldridge," a voice spoke from behind him. "I thought you didn't attend gatherings." He turned to find Nora Owens standing there, her simple blue dress complemented by a shawl against the evening chill. Her hair was down, cascading past her shoulders in waves that caught the lamplight from the building. "I don't," he answered honestly. "Just passing by." For someone just passing by, you've been standing here quite a while." Her observation held no judgment, only gentle amusement. "Would you like to come in? The peach cobbler is excellent." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not dressed for socializing." "You look perfectly presentable to me," she countered. "Besides, I promised to discuss those horses of yours, remember?" Before he could formulate another excuse, she stepped closer and added in a lower voice, "To tell you the truth, Mr. Aldridge, I could use an ally in there. Being the new person in town is rather exhausting. Everyone has questions, and not all of them are ones I wish to answer." Something in her tone, a hint of vulnerability beneath the confidence, resonated with him. Mason found himself nodding and following her toward the entrance. Their arrival caused a momentary lull in conversation. Mason hadn't entered this building since its completion 2 years ago, and his presence alongside the new schoolteacher created an immediate stir of whispers. Sheriff Wallace approached them first. "Mason," he greeted with surprise. "Good to see you here." Mason managed a nod in response as Nora smoothly guided the conversation. "Sheriff, thank you again for your assistance with the school arrangements. I'm looking forward to meeting all my students on Monday." "The pleasure's all ours, Miss Owens." The town's been needing a proper teacher. They made their way further into the hall, with Nora occasionally introducing Mason to newcomers who'd arrived since he'd withdrawn from town life. She handled the social navigation with an ease that allowed him to simply stand beside her, offering minimal responses when required. "Would you care for some punch?" she asked after they'd completed a circuit of the room. "I'd prefer something stronger," he admitted. Nora smiled. "There's coffee in the back." Sheriff Wallace mentioned he added a little something extra to it. They made their way to the refreshment table, where Mason poured 2 cups of the doctored coffee. The whiskey was barely detectable, but he appreciated it nonetheless. "So, Mr. Aldridge," Nora began as they found a relatively quiet corner, "tell me about these horses everyone says you raise." To his own surprise, Mason found himself talking. He described the quarter horses and mustangs he bred, the bloodlines he'd carefully developed, and the training methods he'd perfected over the years. Nora listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that revealed a genuine knowledge of horses. "How did a Boston schoolteacher come to know so much about horseflesh?" he finally asked. A shadow crossed her face. "My father raised horses in Virginia before the war. I grew up around them until I was sent to school in Boston." She took a sip of her coffee. "After he died, there was nothing left of the farm to return to." Mason nodded, understanding loss without needing details. "The war took much from many." "Yes," she agreed quietly, "though sometimes what comes after takes even more." The music shifted to a slower melody as couples moved to the center of the room for a waltz. "I've been told," Nora said after a moment, "that you never dance, Mr. Aldridge." Mason stiffened slightly. "People talk too much in small towns." "Indeed they do." She set down her empty cup. "Is it true?" "I don't dance," he confirmed, his voice flat. "Cannot or will not." She pressed gently. Mason met her gaze, finding no mockery there, only genuine curiosity. "Both, I suppose, never learned properly and never saw the point." Nora considered this. "Dancing serves many purposes, Mr. Aldridge. Sometimes it's celebration, sometimes courtship." She paused. "And sometimes it's simply a way to remember we're still alive." The music swelled around them, and Mason watched the couples moving in synchronized steps across the floor. For a brief moment, he tried to imagine himself among them, but the image wouldn't form. "Would you dance with me, Mr. Aldridge?" Nora asked suddenly. Mason looked at her in surprise, certain he'd misheard. "I just told you I don't dance." "Yes, but you haven't told me you can't learn." She stood and extended her hand. "One dance. If you truly hate it, I promise never to ask again." The entire room seemed to fade away as Mason stared at her outstretched hand. This woman who barely knew him was offering something no one had in years, not pity or judgment, but simply an invitation to step back into the world of the living. "I'll make a fool of myself," he warned. "Perhaps," she agreed with a smile. Or perhaps you'll discover something new. Either way, I won't think less of you. Mason hesitated for another long moment before slowly reaching out to take her hand. Her fingers curled around his, warm and reassuring as she led him toward the edge of the dance floor. We'll start here, away from the center, she said quietly. Just follow my lead at first. She placed his right hand at her waist and held his left hand in hers, standing close enough that he could detect the faint scent of lavender. Now, it's simple. Step back with your right foot, then to the side with your left, then bring your feet together. Mason followed her instructions stiffly, his movements mechanical as he concentrated on not stepping on her feet. After a few awkward attempts, they established a basic rhythm, moving in a small square pattern. See, you're dancing, Mr. Aldridge, Nora said with evident delight. Poorly, he countered, though the corner of his mouth twitched upward. Everyone begins poorly. The important thing is to begin. As they continued, Mason gradually relaxed, his movements becoming less rigid. He became aware of whispers and stares from around the room, but Nora held his attention with conversation, asking about his ranch and life in the territory. When the music ended, they stopped, but Nora didn't immediately step away. Thank you for the dance, Mr. Aldridge. Mason, he corrected her impulsively. If we're going to dance together, you might as well use my given name, her smile brightened. Mason then, and I'm Nora. They returned to their corner as the band struck up a livelier tune. Several people approached them, clearly curious about the unexpected partnership, but Nora fielded their questions with graceful deflection. As the evening progressed, Mason found himself staying far longer than he'd intended. He and Nora danced twice more, each time with slightly more confidence on his part. Between dances, they talked, discovering shared interests beyond horses, a love of open spaces, an appreciation for solitude, and surprisingly similar tastes in literature. I should be going, Mason finally said as the gathering began to thin. Dawn comes early at the ranch. Of course, Nora replied. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. It made being the center of attention much more bearable. Mason walked her to the boarding house, the night air cool around them. They moved in comfortable silence until they reached the porch. Would you be willing to show me your ranch sometime? Nora asked. I miss being around horses regularly. Sunday afternoons I'm usually just doing maintenance, Mason offered. You could visit tomorrow if you'd like. I'd like that very much. Mason nodded, suddenly uncertain how to end the evening. He settled for a simple, "Good night, Nora." "Good night, Mason," she replied with a smile that stayed with him all the way back to his ranch. The next morning, Mason found himself tidying the ranch house, something he rarely bothered with when living alone. He swept the floors, cleared the table of gun parts and tack repair tools, and even changed the faded curtains his sister had hung years ago. By midday, he was out in the corral working with a young mare when he heard the approach of a wagon. Nora sat beside Reverend Collins, who waved as they pulled up to the hitching post. Thought I'd give our new teacher a proper tour of the area, the Reverend explained as he helped Nora down. She mentioned you'd invited her to see the horses. I hope that's still acceptable, Nora added. Reverend Collins kindly offered transportation. Of course, Mason replied, opening the corral gate and stepping out to greet them properly. I'll return in 2 hours, the Reverend said. Need to prepare for evening services anyway. After the Reverend departed, Mason led Nora around the ranch, showing her the barn, corrals, and the small but growing herd of horses he'd bred. She moved among the animals with natural ease, speaking softly to them and earning their trust quickly. You have a gift with them, Mason observed as a usually skittish yearling allowed Nora to stroke his neck. They respond to honesty, she replied. Horses always know when you're hiding something. She gave him a sidelong glance. Rather like certain cowboys. Mason raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting I'm hiding something? Everyone hides something, Mason, some just more than others. She patted the yearling once more before turning to face him fully. For instance, You pretend to be completely detached from the town, yet you know everyone's name and business. You claim to dislike socializing, yet you conversed quite comfortably last night. Her observations were uncomfortably accurate. Mason changed the subject. Would you like to see the main house? The ranch house was modest, but solid 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a central living area with a stone fireplace. Mason had built most of it himself after returning from the war, expanding it over the years as his horse business grew. It's lovely, Nora said, running her hand along the oak dining table. Did you make this? Mason nodded. Winter project 3 years ago, not much to do when the snow comes. You're a man of many talents. Necessary talents out here. A man either learns to be self-sufficient or he doesn't survive. And women, Nora asked, what must they be to survive? Stronger than men, usually, Mason answered honestly. Life's harder on women in these parts. Nora smiled at his response. A surprisingly enlightened view from a man who's supposedly unsociable. Observation doesn't require socializing, he countered, offering her coffee, which she accepted. They sat at the table, steam rising from their cups as silence settled comfortably between them. Mason found himself studying her features, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the small scar near her right temple partially hidden by her hair. May I ask you something personal? Nora broke the silence. Mason tensed slightly but nodded. Why did you dance with me last night? Everyone seemed so shocked. I gather it's been quite some time since you participated in such activities. Mason considered evading the question but found himself answering truthfully. I'm not entirely sure. Something about the way you asked, perhaps. No expectation, no judgment. Is that unusual in your experience? Yes, he admitted. People formed their opinions of me long ago. They expect certain behavior. And you oblige them, Nora observed. It's easier that way, isn't it? When people expect nothing from you, they can't be disappointed. The insight struck close enough to truth that Mason fell silent, sipping his coffee rather than responding. I apologize, Nora said after a moment. I've overstepped. No, Mason replied. You're just perceptive. Their conversation drifted to safer topics, the upcoming school term, the horses Nora might recommend for the children to learn riding, the changing seasons, and what they meant for ranch work. By the time Reverend Collins returned, Mason was surprised to realize how quickly the time had passed. I've enjoyed this afternoon, Nora said as she prepared to leave. Thank you for showing me your home. You're welcome to visit again, Mason found himself saying. Perhaps next Sunday. Her smile was answer enough. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Nora established herself as Redemption Springs schoolteacher, quickly winning the respect of parents and the adoration of students. Every Sunday, she visited the ranch, sometimes riding out on a horse borrowed from the livery, other times catching a ride with whoever was headed in that direction. During these visits, Mason taught her about his training methods, and they often rode together across his land. In turn, Nora shared stories of her students and brought books from her personal collection that she thought might interest him. On Saturday evenings, Mason began appearing at town gatherings, not all of them, but enough that people no longer fell silent in shock when he entered. He and Nora always danced at least once, his steps becoming more natural with practice. The townsfolk watched this development with a mixture of fascination and speculation. Mason Aldridge, the man who had stood apart for so long, was gradually rejoining the community, and everyone knew it was because of the new schoolteacher. You've caused quite a stir, Sheriff Wallace commented to Nora one afternoon as she left the schoolhouse. Getting our resident hermit to socialize. Mr. Aldridge makes his own decisions, Nora replied diplomatically. I simply enjoy his company. Be careful there, the sheriff advised. Mason's got history that makes him keep his distance. Wouldn't want to see you disappointed. Nora's expression cooled slightly. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I'm quite capable of managing my own acquaintances. As autumn progressed toward winter, Mason found himself looking forward to Nora's visits with an anticipation he hadn't felt for anything in years. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of ranch management, philosophical discussions sparked by books they'd both read. One crisp November afternoon, they rode to the highest point of Mason's property, where the land overlooked a sweeping valley below. The aspens had turned golden, creating a stark contrast against the evergreens and red rock formations in the distance. "It's breathtaking," Nora said as they dismounted to rest the horses. "This is where I decided to stay," Mason told her, surprising himself with the admission. "After the war, after losing my family, I rode out here and sat for hours. Something about seeing so much space, so much possibility. It made continuing seem worthwhile." Nora sat beside him on a flat boulder. "What happened to your family, if you don't mind my asking?" Mason was silent for so long that Nora began to apologize for the question, but he finally spoke. "Apache raid, 1863. I was away fighting for the Union. My parents, my younger brother." He stopped, the memories still painful after 15 years. "By the time I returned, there was nothing left but ash and graves." Nora's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "I'm sorry, Mason. It was a long time ago." "Some wounds don't heal with time alone," she said softly. "They need to be tended." Mason looked at their joined hands, then at Nora's face. The understanding he saw there wasn't pity, but recognition, the knowledge of someone who had also carried grief. "What about your family?" he asked. "You mentioned your father died, but what about the rest?" Nora's gaze shifted to the distant horizon. "My mother passed when I was 12, consumption. My father never remarried. After the war, he struggled to rebuild what was left of our farm." She paused. "He died 5 years ago. Shot by men who claimed our land had been seized legally during Reconstruction." The bitterness in her voice revealed more than her words. Mason tightened his grip on her hands slightly. "Is that why you came west? To leave those memories behind?" "Partly," she acknowledged. "But also because after fighting in the courts for 2 years and losing everything, I needed to go somewhere completely different, somewhere I could build something new. And you chose teaching in a frontier town." A small smile curved her lips. "I chose possibility, just as you did." The advertisement for a teacher in Arizona Territory appeared at exactly the right moment. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. Mason was acutely aware of Nora's hand in his, of her presence beside him in this place that had always been his private sanctuary. "We should head back before dark," he said eventually, reluctantly releasing her hand. As they rode home in the fading light, Mason found himself stealing glances at Nora's profile. Something had shifted between them that afternoon, a deepening of understanding, a sharing of truths usually kept hidden. The first snow came early that year, blanketing Redemption Springs in white a week before Thanksgiving. The schoolhouse closed for 2 days as the storm passed, and Mason found himself riding into town despite the weather, concerned about Nora's welfare at the boarding house. He found her in the general store, helping Mrs. Peterson inventory supplies. Her face brightened when she saw him, sending an unexpected warmth through his chest despite the chill outside. "Mason, what brings you to town in this weather?" "Wanted to make sure everyone had what they needed," he replied, not quite admitting he'd come specifically to check on her. "That's thoughtful of you," she said with a knowing smile that suggested she understood his true purpose. "Mrs. Peterson and I were just discussing Thanksgiving arrangements. The town is planning a communal dinner at the hall. Best way to ensure everyone has a proper holiday meal," Mrs. Peterson added. "You'll join us this year, won't you, Mr. Aldridge? Miss Owens mentioned you make an excellent apple pie." Mason shot Nora a questioning look. He'd mentioned his pie-making skills exactly once during one of their Sunday conversations. "I might have been boasting about your culinary talents," Nora admitted with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Now you'll have to prove me right." "I haven't attended a town Thanksgiving in years," Mason hedged, All the more reason to join us this year, Mrs. Peterson declared. We'll expect that pie, Mr. Aldridge. Somehow, Mason found himself agreeing to not only attend but to contribute to the meal. As he and Nora left the store together, he gave her a sidelong glance. "You're gradually entangling me in every town event, aren't you?" Nora laughed, the sound bright in the snow-muffled street. "Is it really so terrible, being part of the community again?" Mason considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. Now, he wasn't so sure. "It's different," he finally said. "Takes some getting used to." "Different can be good," Nora pointed out, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. Mason noticed her shiver and impulsively offered his arm. "May I escort you back to the boarding house?" Nora slipped her arm through his. "That would be lovely. Though I must warn you, Mrs. Henson will likely invite you to dinner once she sees you at her door." "I think I can survive one dinner," Mason replied, surprising himself with how little the prospect bothered him. True to Nora's prediction, the widow Henson not only invited Mason to dinner, but insisted he stay, citing the worsening weather outside. Mason found himself seated at a table with Nora, Mrs. Henson, and the boarding house's 3 other residents, the new bank clerk, an elderly gentleman who had once prospected for silver, and a young widow who worked at the dress shop. The conversation flowed easily, with Mrs. Henson drawing out even the most reticent of her boarders. Mason contributed more than he expected to, sharing a humorous story about a particularly stubborn mule that had everyone laughing. "My goodness, Mr. Aldridge," Mrs. Henson exclaimed, "you should join us more often. I don't believe I've ever heard you speak so much at one time." Mason caught Nora's eye across the table. "I suppose I'm out of practice with conversation." "Well, you seem to be relearning quickly enough," the widow observed with a knowing glance between him and Nora. After dinner, with the snow still falling heavily outside, Mrs. Henson insisted Mason take the small guest room rather than risk the ride back to his ranch in the dark. "The horses are safely in the livery, and you can head home at first light," she said firmly. Mason found himself agreeing, partly due to the widow's persuasiveness and partly because he was reluctant to end the evening. After the other boarders retired, he and Nora sat in the small parlor near the fire, a chessboard between them. "You're a surprisingly good player," Nora commented as Mason captured her bishop. "My father taught me," he replied, memories stirring. "We played most winter evenings." "My father taught me as well," Nora said, studying the board. "He said it built strategic thinking." They played in comfortable silence for a while, each move considered carefully. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the house, making the warmth of the parlor all the more appreciated. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Nora said eventually, looking up from the board. "The town Christmas dance is in 3 weeks. Would you consider being my escort?" Mason's hand hovered over a pawn. "That's a bit more formal than our usual dancing arrangement." "Yes," she agreed simply, waiting for his answer. Mason moved his piece before responding. "People will talk." "People already talk, Mason. They've been talking since the first time we danced." He met her gaze. "And that doesn't bother you, being linked to the town recluse? Does it bother you?" She countered. "Being linked to the headstrong Eastern schoolteacher? No," he answered honestly. "It doesn't." Nora's smile was soft in the firelight. "Then why should I care what others think? I enjoy your company. I'd like to attend the dance with you officially, rather than simply meeting there and dancing once or twice." The implications of her request weren't lost on Mason. Attending as her escort would be a public declaration of something? Interest at the very least, possibly more. "I'd be honored," he finally said, the words feeling both foreign and right on his tongue. Nora's expression brightened. "Excellent. Now I believe I have you in check." Mason looked down at the board in surprise, finding his king indeed threatened. "Well played, Miss Owens," he conceded, focusing once more on the game. The snow continued for 2 more days, and Mason remained in town longer than intended, helping clear paths and checking on elderly residents. Each evening he returned to the boarding house for dinner, and each night he and Nora played chess or read aloud to each other in the parlor while the storm raged outside. By the time Mason returned to his ranch, something fundamental had changed. His home, which had always been his sanctuary, now felt strangely empty. The silence, once comforting, echoed with absence. He threw himself into work, repairing storm damage and ensuring his horses were properly cared for after the unexpected early winter blast. But his thoughts continually drifted to Nora, her laugh, her insightful observations, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Thanksgiving arrived, bringing clear skies and milder temperatures. Mason baked his promised apple pie and rode into town early to help with preparations. The town hall had been transformed, long tables set up end to end and decorated with autumn colors. Nearly everyone in Redemption Springs attended, from the wealthiest ranch owners to the poorest laborers. Mason found himself seated beside Nora, surrounded by her students and their families. The children, initially shy around him, gradually warmed up when Nora encouraged them to ask about his horses. Before long, Mason was promising spring riding lessons to several eager young pupils. "You're good with them," Nora observed quietly as the meal progressed. "Children are straightforward," Mason replied. "They say what they mean and mean what they say. It's refreshing." "Unlike us complicated adults," she teased. "Exactly." He offered her more cider. "Though some adults are more straightforward than others." Nora accepted the drink, her fingers brushing his. "I'll take that as a compliment." It was meant as one. The days following Thanksgiving saw increased activity in town as Redemption Springs prepared for Christmas. Mason found himself volunteering to help construct new decorations for the town hall and repair the church nativity scene that had been damaged in storage. Each task brought him into more regular contact with townspeople who had once given him a wide berth. Gradually, the wariness with which they regarded him gave way to casual greetings, then to actual conversations. Mason discovered that after years of isolation, he actually enjoyed certain aspects of community involvement. On Sundays, Nora still visited the ranch, but now she sometimes brought students whose parents had given permission for riding lessons. Mason found himself looking forward to these group visits almost as much as the quiet afternoons when it was just the two of them. 2 weeks before Christmas, a particularly harsh cold snap descended on the territory. Mason rode into town with extra firewood for the schoolhouse, arriving just as classes were ending for the day. "Mr. Aldridge," several children called out as he dismounted, his arms full of split logs. "Good afternoon," he greeted them, nodding to Nora, who stood in the doorway watching with evident pleasure. "Are you bringing Miss Owens more books?" one girl asked, eyeing his saddlebags. "Firewood today," he answered. "Books next time." The children dispersed to waiting parents as Mason carried the wood inside. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with a pot-bellied stove in the center. Desks were arranged in neat rows, and a small desk at the front held Nora's teaching materials. "This is unexpected," Nora said, closing the door against the cold, "but very welcome. The stove's been struggling to keep up with this weather." Mason stacked the wood neatly by the stove. "Thought you might need it. The mercantile was running low yesterday." "You rode all the way to town just to bring me firewood?" Nora asked, her voice softening. "Had business with the blacksmith anyway," Mason replied, though they both knew it wasn't the entire truth. Nora moved closer, reaching out to brush snowflakes from his coat. "Thank you, Mason." The simple gesture and the warmth in her voice created an intimacy that made Mason acutely aware of how alone they were in the small schoolhouse. Nora seemed to realize it too, her hand lingering on his arm as their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Then Mason slowly raised his hand to touch her cheek, his rough fingertips gentle against her skin. Nora leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "I should go," he said softly, though he made no move to step away. "Should you?" she asked, equally quiet. Mason hesitated, torn between desire and uncertainty. This woman had somehow become essential to him over the past months, bringing light and purpose back into his life when he'd thought such things permanently beyond his reach. "I don't want to compromise your position," he finally said. "A schoolteacher is held to certain standards." Nora smiled at this. "Always so honorable," she murmured, "but I'm not concerned, Mason, not about that." "What are you concerned about then? Whether you're ready?" Her gaze was steady, searching, "For what might happen if you don't go?" The honesty of her answer struck him deeply. Was he ready? After years of deliberately avoiding connections, of keeping everyone at a safe distance, was he prepared to risk his carefully constructed solitude? Looking at Nora, her intelligence, her strength, her understanding of his broken places, Mason realized the question wasn't whether he was ready to risk his solitude, but whether he could bear to return to it if she were no longer part of his life. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, Mason leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Nora responded, her arms sliding around his neck to draw him closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Only weeks," Nora teased. "I've been hoping you would since that first dance." Mason chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. "I was too busy trying not to step on your feet." Their second kiss was longer, more assured, a proper exploration of this new territory between them. Mason marveled at how right it felt to hold her, how perfectly she fit against him. A sharp knock at the door startled them apart. Mrs. Peterson's voice called out, "Miss Owens, are you still here? I've brought those geography texts you requested." Nora smoothed her hair and called back, "Yes, just a moment." To Mason, she whispered with a mischievous smile, "To be continued." The days leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Mason and Nora were careful to maintain propriety in public, but private moments were stolen whenever possible after school hours, during rides on his property, in the church vestibule after Sunday services. Each encounter deepened Mason's certainty that what was growing between them was something rare and precious. They spoke of their pasts more openly now, sharing the painful memories they'd both carried alone for so long. In Nora, Mason found not just a romantic partner but a true companion who understood the shadows he carried without being afraid of them. The night of the Christmas dance arrived with clear skies and a full moon that turned the snow-covered landscape into a sea of silver. Mason arrived at the boarding house promptly at 7, dressed in his finest clothes, a dark suit he hadn't worn in years, freshly pressed and paired with a new shirt purchased specifically for the occasion. Mrs. Henson answered his knock, her eyes widening appreciatively at his appearance. "My goodness, Mr. Aldridge, you clean up remarkably well." She ushered him inside. "Nora will be down momentarily. May I offer you some coffee while you wait?" Before Mason could answer, he heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see Nora descending. She wore a gown of deep green velvet, her hair arranged in an elegant twist with soft tendrils framing her face. Around her throat was a simple silver pendant that caught the lamplight. "You look beautiful," Mason said when he found his voice. Nora's smile was radiant as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "And you are quite handsome tonight, Mr. Aldridge." Mrs. Henson watched their exchange with evident approval. "You two make a fine couple. Now off with you, the dance will be starting soon." The town hall was transformed for the occasion, evergreen boughs and red ribbons adorning every surface. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the gathering crowd. A small band was setting up in the corner, and tables laden with food and drink lined one wall. Their entrance together caused the expected stir, but Mason found he didn't mind the attention. With Nora's hand resting on his arm, he felt a pride he hadn't experienced in years. Sheriff Wallace approached them first, tipping his hat to Nora. "Miss Owens, you look lovely tonight." To Mason, he extended his hand. Good to see you here, Mason. Officially, that is. Mason shook the offered hand, acknowledging the significance. Wouldn't miss it, Sheriff. They made their way through the crowd, accepting greetings and well wishes. Mason was struck by how different this felt from his previous reluctant appearances at town functions. There was an ease to the interactions now, a sense of belonging he'd forgotten was possible. When the music began, Mason led Nora to the dance floor without hesitation. Months of practice had given him confidence in his abilities, and they moved together with natural harmony. "Everyone's watching us," Nora murmured as they glided across the floor. "Let them watch," Mason replied, surprising himself with his lack of concern. "They've never seen me happy before." Must be quite a novelty. Nora's eyes widened slightly at his words. "Are you happy?" Mason gazed down at her, suddenly aware of how completely this woman had transformed his life in just 6 months. "Yes," he answered simply, "for the first time in many years." They danced nearly every dance that evening, taking breaks only to refresh themselves and socialize briefly with other attendees. As midnight approached, Mason led Nora outside to the porch, where the crisp winter air provided a welcome respite from the warmth inside. The street was quiet, most of the town's inhabitants either at the dance or home in bed. Moonlight bathed everything in soft light, and their breath formed small clouds in the cold air. "I have something for you," Mason said, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift." He withdrew a small wooden box, hand-carved with a pattern of wild roses. Nora took it with careful hands, admiring the workmanship before opening the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a silver bracelet fashioned from interlocking horseshoes, delicate despite the rugged inspiration. "Mason, it's exquisite," she breathed, lifting it from the box. "I worked with the silversmith," he explained. "The design is mine, but he helped with the execution." Nora extended her wrist, and Mason fastened the bracelet around it. "It's perfect," she said, turning her arm to admire how the silver caught the moonlight. "I have something for you as well, though it's back at the boarding house." "You can give it to me tomorrow," Mason said, taking her hands in his. "Tonight I have something else I want to say." Nora looked up at him expectantly, her expression open and attentive. Mason took a deep breath, gathering courage for words he'd never expected to speak again. "When you first came to Redemption Springs, I was existing, not living, just continuing from one day to the next. I had my horses, my land, and I thought that was enough." He squeezed her hands gently. "You changed that. You made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow, to want more than mere survival." He paused, emotion making his voice rougher than usual. "I love you, Nora. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you asked me to dance." Nora's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "I love you too, Mason, more than I thought possible when I came here seeking a new beginning." Mason pulled her closer, one hand rising to cup her cheek. "I'm not an easy man. I have rough edges and old wounds. But if you'll have me, I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of your love." "You already are," Nora whispered, raising herself on tiptoes to meet his kiss. They returned to the dance hand in hand, both aware that something profound had shifted between them. As the final dance of the evening began, Mason held Nora close, moving with a freedom and joy that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. From across the room, Mrs. Peterson nudged her husband. "Would you look at that? A year ago, folks said Mason Aldridge would never dance. Now look at him, can barely keep his feet on the floor." "It's the company he keeps," Mr. Peterson replied sagely. "That schoolteacher brought him back to life." The weeks following Christmas were the happiest of Mason's adult life. He and Nora spent every possible moment together, dividing their time between the schoolhouse, the ranch, and increasingly frequent dinners with friends in town. In February, during a rare warm spell, Mason took Nora riding to a secluded spot on his property, a small mesa overlooking a winding creek. He spread a blanket on the ground, and they shared a simple picnic as the winter sun bathed them in weak but welcome warmth. "I've been thinking," Mason said as they finished their meal, A dangerous pastime, Nora teased. Indeed. He smiled, then grew serious. The ranch house is too big for just one person. Nora set down her cup, her full attention on him. Is it? It was built for a family, Mason continued. Originally my parents', then meant to be mine someday. After they died, I kept expanding it, though I told myself it was just to increase its value. And now, Nora prompted softly when he paused. Mason took her hand, running his thumb over her knuckles. Now I know I was building it for you. For us, I just didn't know it yet. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. Nora Owens, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of making that house a home again, of building a life together there? Nora's free hand covered her mouth as Mason opened the pouch and tipped a ring into his palm. It was a simple gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was my mother's, he explained. The only thing I have left of hers. Mason, Nora breathed, her eyes filling with tears. Yes, I will marry you. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger as if it had been made for her. Mason pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't capture. They were married in April, when the desert bloomed with unexpected color. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church, and followed by a celebration that spilled into the street outside. Mason and Nora danced until midnight, and no one who saw them could doubt the happiness they'd found together. Life settled into new rhythms after their wedding. Nora continued teaching, riding to and from town each day on a gentle mare Mason had trained specifically for her. Evenings and weekends were spent together at the ranch, which flourished under their combined care. Nora started a small library in one corner of the living room, ordering books from as far away as San Francisco and New York. Mason expanded the corral and added a special stable for the school horses, as he'd begun a program teaching local children to ride safely. They attended every town gathering together, and Mason always danced, his once stiff movements now fluid and natural, especially with his wife in his arms. The townsfolk eventually stopped remarking on the transformation, accepting the new Mason Aldridge as readily as they had once avoided the old one. One evening in early autumn, a year and a half after Nora's arrival in Redemption Springs, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Mason's arm was around his wife's shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. I have news, Nora said after a companionable silence. Oh, Mason looked down at her, noting the special glow in her eyes. Dr. Matthews confirmed it today, she continued, taking his free hand and placing it gently on her stomach. We're going to have a baby. Joy unlike anything Mason had ever known surged through him. A baby, he repeated, voice thick with emotion. When? Spring, Nora answered, smiling up at him. April or May, the doctor thinks. Mason gathered her carefully into his arms, pressing his forehead to hers. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For everything. For asking me to dance that night. For seeing something in me worth saving. For this life we're building. Nora kissed him softly. We saved each other, Mason, and we'll keep doing so every day. As darkness fell around them, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about the future, the child they would raise, the family they would be, the love that had found them both when they least expected it. In town, the story was still sometimes told how the townsfolk said the cowboy would never dance, until a woman took his hand and he never sat again. But those who knew Mason and Nora Aldridge understood it wasn't just about dancing. It was about a man who had stopped living, finding his way back to life, one step at a time, with the right partner by his side. Their daughter was born the following May, a strong, healthy girl with her father's eyes and her mother's determined spirit. They named her Hope, for what had brought them together and what continued to guide them forward. And on warm summer evenings, when the work was done and the sun hung low in the sky, Mason would take Nora in his arms and they would dance on the porch of their home, their daughter watching from her cradle, learning early that love was a thing in motion, always moving, always growing, never still. 3 years later, Hope was joined by a brother, Samuel, who inherited his father's quiet nature and his mother's love of books. The Aldridge Ranch became known throughout the territory not just for its fine horses, but for its hospitality, its library, and the dancing that could be heard whenever friends gathered there. Mason never forgot how close he had come to missing it, all how easily he might have turned away that night when Nora offered her hand. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would watch his wife teaching their children or reading by lamplight, and marvel at how completely one decision had transformed his life. The townsfolk still remembered when Mason Aldridge wouldn't dance, when he barely spoke, when he lived as a ghost among them. But that man was gone now, replaced by one who moved through life with purpose and joy, who never again took for granted the simple pleasure of being in motion with the one he loved.